They were not beaten by the Japanese. They were left behind by their own. On the night of August 9th, 1942, 11,000 Marines woke up and found the American fleet was gone. No warning, no goodbye, just an empty horizon where, the day before, warships had filled the sea as far as the eye could see. And those ships had taken almost everything with them: food, ammunition, barbed wire, heavy equipment, everything a force needs to hold an island ringed by the enemy. What remained was brutal in its simplicity. 37 days of rations, 4 days of ammunition, no air cover, no naval support, and beyond the jungle, an enemy that had not lost a single major ground battle since the war began. Washington had already written the island off. The Navy had already sailed away. Every cold military calculation pointed to the same answer. Guadalcanal was already lost. General Alexander Vandegrift stood on that beach and stared at that empty horizon. Then he turned his back on it. He spread out his maps, and in the next 6 hours, he made a decision that would force Japan to do something it had never done in this war: retreat. This is the story of that night, and of the men who stayed. To understand why a tiny island that barely appeared on most maps mattered so much, you have to understand where Japan stood in the summer of 1942. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japan controlled a stretch of territory nearly the size of the continental United States: Malaya, Singapore, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Burma. And now, in the Solomon Islands, they were building an airfield on a small jungle island called Guadalcanal. That airfield was not defensive. It was a weapon aimed outward. Operating from Guadalcanal, Japanese aircraft could threaten the supply lines running from the United States down to Australia and New Zealand. Cut those lines, and America loses its only staging ground for a counteroffensive in the Pacific. Every plan to push back Japan would have to be torn up and written again from scratch. Tokyo understood that. Washington understood it too. But the decision to strike back came in such a rush, it bordered on recklessness. Planning took weeks instead of months. The maps used by staff officers were torn from a National Geographic magazine. There were no proper aerial reconnaissance photographs, no reliable information on the terrain, no dependable reading of the weather, no certainty about how many Japanese troops were even on the island. This was what Washington handed Vandegrift: an underprepared mission on an unsurveyed island with troops who had not finished training. Vandegrift knew every bit of that. He took the order and did not complain, because he understood something many men in Washington did not. Japanese ground forces in the Pacific had not yet lost a major engagement. Waiting until everything was ready sounded sensible, but in reality it meant waiting until it was too late. So on August 7th, 1942, the Marines hit the beaches of Guadalcanal. They seized the airfield in a single day. The Japanese garrison, mostly construction workers and a small naval guard unit, fled into the jungle. They left behind equipment, food stores, construction machinery, everything, still sitting in place as if the workday had simply stopped. Vandegrift believed the hardest part might already be over. But the truth was the opposite. The morning of August 7th, the Marines came ashore under naval gunfire from ships offshore. They were ready for a savage fight. It never came. The Japanese on the island ran. Construction equipment was abandoned. Bags of rice were left stacked where they stood. Canned food remained untouched. Cases of Japanese beer still sat inside storage sheds. By the end of the day, the Marines held the unfinished airfield. Vandegrift sent a report back to command. Progress was better than expected. Nobody understood that this was the last quiet moment the campaign would ever have. That same night, a few hundred miles to the north, Admiral Gunichi Mikawa drove a task force of 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer hard toward Guadalcanal. He knew exactly what he intended to do. In the early hours of August 9th, Mikawa's fleet slipped into Tsavo Sound under total darkness. No radar was needed. The Japanese had trained for years for precisely this kind of night surface battle, while the American Navy had never treated it as a true priority. What followed took less than 40 minutes. 4 Allied cruisers were sent to the bottom: USS Quincy, USS Vincennes, USS Astoria, the Australian cruiser Canberra. More than 1,000 sailors were killed. It was the worst open water defeat in the history of the United States Navy, and it happened while the Marines on the island were asleep. And yet, even then, Mikawa did not finish the job. He looked out and saw the approach wide open. American transports still sat offshore, loaded with food, ammunition, and equipment. Almost nothing was left to protect them. He could have destroyed them right there. But Mikawa feared air attack once daylight came, so he turned his fleet around and headed back to Rabaul. That choice would haunt him for the rest of his life. Because those transports, even though Admiral Turner later ordered them out, had already managed to offload just enough supplies to keep the Marines alive in the first months of the campaign. If Mikawa had destroyed them that night, Guadalcanal might have ended before it truly began. Turner received word of the disaster at Savo before dawn. He did the math. The escort fleet was effectively gone. Admiral Fletcher had already withdrawn his carriers. Fletcher feared losses and left without proper notice. No air cover, no naval shield. Turner made his decision. Every remaining transport would leave immediately, under darkness. Nobody warned Vandegrift before those ships pulled anchor. So when the sun rose on August 9th, a Marine scout came running to find him. Vandegrift stepped outside and looked toward the water. Nothing. Not a single ship. Later, in his memoirs, he wrote that it was the moment he felt completely abandoned, not by the enemy, by his own navy. But at that moment, he did not waste time on bitterness. He walked back into his tent, called in his staff officers, and got to work. The meeting was quiet. Nobody panicked. Nobody shouted. There were no speeches, no grand declarations. Just officers around a field table, looking at hard numbers on paper and understanding exactly how bad their situation was. Vandegrift asked for a straight assessment, no sugarcoating, no false optimism. The answer was stark. 4 days of ammunition at full combat intensity, 37 days of food if rationing began at once. Not enough barbed wire to secure the full defensive perimeter, no artillery support, no air cover, and somewhere beyond the darkness, an enemy already moving toward them. 11,000 men on an island 90 miles long, no way out. Two choices sat on the table. The first was the safe choice. Pull back. Consolidate the force into a tight defensive ring around the beach. Dig in. String the wire. Hold what you can, and wait for reinforcements. It was the option every military textbook would recommend when a force is cut off and running short on supplies. The second choice was far more dangerous. Finish the airfield. Not defense, not delay. Build the one thing that could change the entire equation, a functioning runway. With an airfield, aircraft could arrive. With aircraft, the Marines could create their own air cover. They would not have to wait for the Navy to return. But finishing the field meant sending men outside the perimeter, spreading the force thinner, and accepting the risk of being hit before the work was done. If the Japanese attacked before the runway was ready, there would be no fallback plan. Vandegrift stared at the map for a long moment. Then he pointed at the airfield. That decision was not bravado. It was clarity. Because the first option, the supposedly safe one, contained a truth nobody wanted to say aloud. Pull back and wait was only a slower way to die. Without the airfield, there was nothing worth defending, nothing worth resupplying. No reason for Washington to risk ships to save a beach. The Navy was not coming back for sand, but it might come back for an airfield. And the airfield was the only reason Guadalcanal mattered at all. So the order went out. Finish it. The next morning, part of the force dug fighting positions while the rest picked up shovels and went to work on the runway. They worked under a tropical sun that reached 100 degrees by mid-morning. Their uniforms were soaked through before 8 o'clock. Half rations began that first day. Most of the men did not fully grasp the strategic meaning of what they were building. They only knew their general had given the order, and so they worked. On August 18th, 1942, 11 days after the Navy sailed away, a Japanese reconnaissance aircraft flew over Guadalcanal and photographed the island. The runway was finished. The pilot could barely believe it. 11 days earlier, it had been a half-built construction project buried in jungle. Now, it was a working airstrip, completed by hand, using equipment the Japanese themselves had abandoned, built by men surviving on 2 meals a day in 100-degree heat. Vandegrift named it Henderson Field, after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at Midway 2 months earlier. The next day, 19 aircraft landed on Henderson Field. Wildcats, Dauntlesses, old planes, patched-together planes. Not the finest aircraft America could send, but they were there, on the island, under Marine control. Guadalcanal now had air cover. Those pilots called themselves the Cactus Air Force, after Guadalcanal's allied codename. There was nothing romantic about it. They slept in foxholes beside the runway because tents could not survive the bombing. They flew 3 or 4 missions a day. Take off, intercept Japanese aircraft, land, refuel, go up again. Between sorties, they lay beneath the wings of their own planes and slept in sweat-soaked flight suits. Fuel came from drums on the field, some of it pumped from ships sunk offshore. When an aircraft took too much damage to fly again, mechanics stripped every usable part from it and bolted those pieces onto another plane. Nothing was wasted. Some mornings, a pilot walked out to his aircraft, not entirely sure how many other machines had been sacrificed to keep that one flying. He flew anyway. 900 miles to the north at Rabaul, Admiral Yamamoto studied the intelligence report and understood the danger at once. Henderson Field was not just an airstrip, it was a trap. Any fleet approaching Guadalcanal in daylight would come within range of aircraft flying from Henderson. Japanese ships could still operate there at night. They could shell the island. They could land troops. They could run supplies. But in daylight, they could not stay and fight for control of those waters. Yamamoto saw the problem clearly, and because he saw it clearly, he moved fast. He ordered a ground assault to retake the airfield. He sent in some of his best units, trusting that one hard blow would crush Henderson Field before it became too strong to crack. He badly underestimated how fast Vandegrift had built his defenses. More than that, he completely underestimated the men who were going to hold them. Colonel Kianao Ichiki arrived on Guadalcanal with 900 of Japan's finest troops and absolute certainty about what would happen next. He did not believe he needed reconnaissance. He did not believe he needed artillery preparation. He did not believe he needed a contingency plan. He had Japanese infantry. In his mind, that was enough. On the night of August 21st, Ichiki led his men in a direct charge along the beach east of Henderson Field. The plan was brutally simple. Hit the Marine line at midnight, drive straight through with speed and bayonets, break the defense before dawn. Those tactics had worked in China. They had worked in Malaya. They had worked in the Philippines. They did not work here. The Marines were waiting. Barbed wire stopped the first wave cold at the bank of the Ilu River. Machine guns opened from both flanks, and within minutes, the white sand was turning red. Ichiki sent a second wave, then a third. Each one smashed against the wire and came apart under fire. When daylight came, Vandegrift sent tanks and a full battalion around behind what remained of Ichiki's force. Suddenly, there was no escape route, nowhere left to run. 800 of Ichiki's 900 men died on that strip of sand. Ichiki burned his regimental colors. Then he shot himself. It was the first time in the war that Japanese infantry had attacked a properly defended American position and been annihilated, not pushed back, not merely repelled, wiped out. But Vandegrift did not celebrate because he understood something larger was coming. Ichiki was not the end. Ichiki was the first wave. He was right. In September, General Kawaguchi arrived with nearly 3,000 men, 3 times the size of Ichiki's force. And this time, the Japanese would not hurl themselves straight into the beach defenses. Kawaguchi had learned at least part of the lesson. He pushed his men through jungle terrain Vandegrift believed was impassable. He came toward the high ground south of Henderson Field, a narrow ridge that would later become famous as Edson's Ridge. Hold that high ground, and you hold the airfield. Lose it, and you lose everything. On the night of September 12th, Kawaguchi attacked. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson's line, fewer than 800 men, faced nearly 3,000 Japanese soldiers through the darkness. The battle became a night of collapse, recovery, and sheer refusal to give ground. By 3 o'clock in the morning, the perimeter had shrunk to less than 100 yards. Some positions had already broken. Japanese troops were inside the wire. Edson walked the line in that chaos. Calm, no shouting, no wild gestures. He looked men in the eye and told them the truth in words that stripped the moment bare. This is it. There is no better place to die. And still the line held. At 3:30 in the morning, Vandegrift got the call. The perimeter was holding, but barely. He looked down at the list of reserves available to him. 1 battalion, just 1. If he committed that battalion and the line still broke, there would be nothing left to save Henderson Field, nothing left to save Guadalcanal. He committed the battalion. By dawn on September 14th, Kawaguchi was dragging what remained of his force back into the jungle. More than 600 Japanese soldiers lay dead on that hillside. Henderson Field was still standing. Vandegrift sat down and, for the first time in weeks, let out a long breath. But even then, there was no triumph in it, because he knew exactly what he had just spent. His last reserve was gone. If Japan came back with another force of similar size, there was nothing left in hand to stop it. And that is what made Guadalcanal so merciless. The famous battles were savage, yes, but the island itself was often worse. It was not just the artillery, not just the night attacks, not just the fear of what might come out of the jungle after sunset. It was the slow, grinding destruction of the men holding the line, day after day, in ways that did not make headlines and did not look glorious from Washington. Second Lieutenant Roy Elrod arrived on Guadalcanal in November 1942, weighing 190 pounds. He left weighing 165. 25 pounds disappeared in a matter of weeks, not because he gave up eating, Because there was not enough food to eat. That was the real face of the campaign after the major battles. The island wore men down in silence. At night, the Tokyo Express ran. Japan could not move freely by daylight because Henderson Field controlled the sky. But darkness belonged to them. Japanese destroyers raced down the passage, the Marines called the slot, New Georgia Sound, at full speed. They unloaded men and supplies on the beaches before sunrise, then vanished before the Cactus Air Force could get at them. Every night they came. Every morning, Vandegrift looked at his maps, knowing more enemy troops had landed, and there was almost nothing he could do to stop it in darkness. And in the jungle, disease was doing work, bullets could not. By the time the 1st Marine Division was finally relieved in December 1942, more than 8,000 of its men had contracted malaria. Tropical disease had taken 2 out of every 3 men off the line, while enemy fire accounted for only 1 in 3 casualties. That is the kind of number that changes how you understand a campaign. Men were not just fighting Japan, they were fighting fever, exhaustion, hunger, rot, insects, mud, dysentery, and the terrible knowledge that even if they survived the enemy, the island itself might still finish them. Elrod remembered sitting one night on a wooden crate in pouring rain, shaking with malaria, bent over with dysentery, while Japanese mortar rounds landed behind him and mosquitoes swarmed everywhere. He looked up into the darkness and thought, I wonder why they can't get one of those rounds in here where it would do some good. That was not the thought of a man eager to die. It was the thought of a man who had reached the absolute end of what a human being should be able to endure and was still sitting there, still holding his place, because there was nowhere else to go. The order on the island had become brutally simple. Unless your fever was over 104 degrees, you did not leave your post for sick bay. Vandegrift knew all of it. He walked the forward positions every day. He saw the hollowed-out faces. He saw uniforms hanging from bodies that no longer looked like the men who had landed in August. He did not lie to them with promises he could not guarantee. He did not tell them reinforcements were definitely coming, because the truth was he was no longer certain they were. Instead, he sent a cable to Washington, not asking to withdraw, not complaining, just stating the facts, so that if the island could not be held, Washington would at least know why. For days, the cable went unanswered, so the men who had been there the longest survived on whatever the island and the battlefield could give them: coconuts, taro root, lizard meat, rice taken from dead Japanese soldiers. These were the same Marines who had won at the Tenaru River, the same men who had held Edson's Ridge, the same men who had built Henderson Field with their bare hands. And now they were eating the enemy's food to make it through one more day. Still, they did not talk about quitting. And while the Marines clung to the island by their fingernails, another battle was unfolding above them, one that neither side fully understood in the moment. Japan was bleeding out, not only in men on the ground, though those losses were heavy. The deeper wound was in the sky. Over Guadalcanal, Japan's most experienced aviators were dying one mission at a time. These were not ordinary pilots. These were veterans trained for years before the war, men who had flown over China and Burma, men who had struck Pearl Harbor and Midway. Japan had spent the better part of a decade building that corps of elite airmen. They could not be replaced in months. In truth, they could barely be replaced in years. Every day, the Cactus Air Force scrambled to defend Henderson Field. Patched together wildcats, worn aircraft, exhausted young pilots. They were being thrown against Japan's irreplaceable veterans, and Japan was losing that trade badly. By the time the campaign ended, Japan had lost more than 600 aircraft over and around Guadalcanal. More devastating still, the seasoned crews who had given those planes their true value were gone. Yamamoto understood the meaning of that better than anyone in Tokyo. He had watched Japan's naval air power, built over a decade, proven at Pearl Harbor, bloodied at Midway, now being systematically destroyed over a jungle airstrip in the Solomon Islands. He knew what came next. Even if others still wanted to believe otherwise, Japan could still fight. But the kind of war Japan could fight in 1943 was no longer the same war it had launched in 1941. The initiative was gone. The veteran aviators were gone. The margin for error had shrunk to almost nothing. And all of it, the shift in momentum, the slow reversal of the Pacific War, began because the men on that island had been abandoned and refused to leave. On October 18, 1942, a message reached the officers on Guadalcanal. Admiral Robert Gormley had been relieved of command. His replacement was Admiral William Halsey. For the first time in weeks, the Marines laughed. Not because Halsey brought instant relief, not because everything suddenly changed overnight, but because that one name told them Washington had finally understood the truth. Guadalcanal was not a place for passive defense. It was a place that demanded aggression, urgency, and a willingness to fight for every inch. Halsey brought that spirit with him. Supplies began arriving with more regularity. Reinforcements started coming in. The Cactus Air Force received more aircraft, and for the first time since August, Vandegrift could look at his map without immediately calculating how many days of survival he had left. But here is what history too often smooths over. Halsey arrived on October 18th. By then, the Battle of the Tanaru had already been won. Edson's Ridge had already held. Henderson Field had already been built, defended, and made operational. All of that had happened before Halsey ever entered the picture. Vandegrift had already held Guadalcanal together for 11 weeks with no dependable naval shield, no reliable supply line, and no clear guidance beyond two brutal words: hold. Halsey did not save Guadalcanal. He inherited an island Vandegrift had already kept alive with his bare hands, and then carried that hard-won foothold through to final victory. In December 1942, the 1st Marine Division was finally pulled off the island. The men who could still walk made their own way to the beach. The men who could not were carried. More than 8,000 had malaria. Most had lost 20 pounds or more. Their uniforms hung off bodies that no longer resembled the men who had landed 4 months earlier. They looked back at the island one last time as the ships pulled away. Nobody recorded their thoughts. But one fact stood above everything else. The island was still theirs. Then came the final blow to Japan's prestige. In February 1943, Japan quietly evacuated the last 10,000 soldiers remaining on Guadalcanal over 3 consecutive nights. The withdrawal was executed with such precision that American intelligence initially believed it was the beginning of a new offensive. That was how unthinkable the real answer seemed. Only when the truth was confirmed did the full meaning settle in. Guadalcanal was over, and for the first time in the war, Japan had abandoned territory it had taken, not because it had been outnumbered, not because it had simply run out of weapons, but because it had run headlong into something its military machine had no formula for: men who had been left behind and refused to lose. Alexander Vandegrift never became the kind of household name history usually hands to war heroes. There was no Hollywood image burned into public memory, no iconic photograph with sunglasses and a corncob pipe, no famous line taught in every classroom. He was simply the man who stood on a beach on the darkest morning of the war, watched the last ship disappear, and then turned his back on that empty horizon. In 1943, Vandegrift received the Medal of Honor, not for one blazing instant of personal heroism, but for 4 straight months of making the right decision when there was no right decision left to make. And after the war, General Douglas MacArthur said it as clearly as anyone ever could. Before Guadalcanal, the enemy advanced at his pleasure. After Guadalcanal, he retreated at ours. That was the turning point. That was the hinge. The shift from Japan advancing to Japan retreating began on a half-finished runway in the jungle, built by starving men using Japanese equipment on an island their own navy had abandoned. Every campaign that followed Bougainville, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, even the long road toward Tokyo itself, ran through that runway. And that runway did not belong to the admirals who sailed away. It did not belong to the officials in Washington. It belonged to the men who stayed. They were abandoned. They stayed. They won. And that is why Guadalcanal still matters. Not only because of strategy, not only because of geography, but because it revealed something harder than steel and stronger than doctrine. When every calculation said they should collapse, they held. When every condition said they should break, they built. And when the enemy believed time, hunger, disease, and isolation would finish the job, those men answered with the only thing they had left: endurance. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment with the name of someone in your family who served anywhere, in any branch, in any war. Give this story a like, subscribe if you want more, and let their memory keep marching forward.